All right, brace yourself. This one will surely raise an eyebrow or two. Let's talk about the Shema. For such a simple prayer, there's a ton to know. Like, why do we even say it? And why do we sometimes say it quietly and other times out loud? Are we supposed to cover our eyes or not? And should we be sitting or standing? And what's up with all the kissing? God, it's almost too much. So here's what we're going to do. Instead of answering all these questions in one really long video, we'll be exploring the Shema over the next 3 weeks. So let's jump on in and start learning all about this central prayer. So what is the Shema? Well, if Judaism were to have an official creed, it would be the Shema. In essence, it's a declaration of the oneness of God and our acceptance of God's authority, as well as that of the mitzvot, or commandments. The Shema is made up of 4 main parts. The first part is what most likely comes to mind when you think of the Shema. It comes from the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy and is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, which means, listen Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. The second part is what we call the Ahavta. This part contains the verses in the Torah that come immediately after the first line of the Shema, and it speaks to the obligation to love and serve God by obeying the commandments, the need to teach the Torah and the commandments to our children, as well as the mitzvot of tefillin and mezuzah. I'll speak more on those in a separate video. This section also includes the instructions to say the Shema when we lay down and when we rise up, when sitting at home and when walking on the way, and therefore is the original source for our obligation to say the Shema. The third part of the Shema comes from a bit further on in Deuteronomy and begins with the words V'haya im Shemoah. This section echoes some of the language from V'ahavta, but also speaks to the theme of divine reward and punishment. In communities where most of the Shema is said out loud, this section is usually recited quietly, as people tend to be uncomfortable with the theology contained in it. But it's also possible to read it simply as a description of how the world works. That is, if we do right by others and maintain a just society, things should go well for us. And if we fail to do so, then watch out. Finally, the fourth part of the Shema comes from the book of Numbers and begins with the words Vayomer. This section references the mitzvah of tzitzit, or the fringes attached to the corner of a talit, or a prayer shawl. The Vayomer section teaches us that the tzitzit are there to remind us of the commandments and not to be led astray by our eyes and lustful desires. It's a bit strange to jump around to various sections of the Torah and say them in this particular order. Why these texts and not others? According to the Talmud, when the temple stood in Jerusalem, the priests would recite these passages as part of their morning rituals. When the temple was destroyed and personal prayer came to replace temple worship, we maintained the practice of saying the Shema. The Talmud also explains the reason for the jumbled order of texts. We begin with the first verse of the Shema as it declares the oneness of God and lays the foundation for all other beliefs. The V'ahavta paragraph then speaks to 3 central obligations: to learn, to teach, and to perform the mitzvot. V'haya im Shemoah then speaks to 2 of those obligations: to teach and to perform the mitzvot. And Vayomer speaks only to the one obligation, to perform the mitzvot. So we prioritize the passages that cover more obligations. So when do we say the Shema? Well, as we read in the V'ahavta section, we should say it when we lay down and when we rise up. In other words, we say the Shema in the morning and in the evening, usually as part of our morning and evening prayers, Shacharit and Mariv. But even if you say the Shema as part of Mariv, there's still the custom to say Shema al Hamitah, or the bedtime Shema, as you're going to sleep. All right, so we've had a bit of an overview and learned not only what makes up the Shema, but also when to say it. In the next 2 videos, we'll learn about how and why we cover our eyes, kiss the tzitzit, say some things quietly, and whether we should sit or stand when we say this important prayer. Thank you for joining me for this week's Taste of Torah. Please join me again next week as we continue our exploration of the Shema.